concluded. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm Australia's economic performance in the September quarter is the worst out of the 28 OECD countries that have reported? If the government had done its jobs on vaccines and quarantine, wouldn't the economy have grown like the others and not shrunk?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm to the House that other than two major advanced economies, Australia has had the strongest recovery, Mr Speaker, across the world. A stronger recovery than we've seen in the United Kingdom, Mr Speaker. A stronger recovery than we've seen in Canada, Mr Speaker. A stronger recovery than we've seen in Germany, Mr Speaker. A stronger recovery than we've seen in Italy, Mr Speaker. And a stronger recovery than we've seen in Japan, Mr Speaker. And the credit is due to the Australian people, Mr Speaker, to the hard work of 26 million Australians who have faced the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. Mr Speaker, who have faced the first pandemic in a century. And we all remember those images last March, of thousands of our fellow Australians lining up outside Centrelink, either having lost their jobs, Mr Speaker, and businesses were fearful of losing not only their business but also their homes. And the Morrison government responded with the strongest economic support this country has ever seen. Around $300 billion of economic support, more than all the states and territories put together. Programs like JobKeeper that saved 700,000 jobs, Mr Speaker, and the cash flow boost, and business and support payments to pensioners and carers and veterans and others on income support, and business investment incentives that today in the national accounts see business investment 9.1% higher through the year, Mr Speaker, and programs like Home Builder, which was ridiculed by those opposite, but together with our other policies have seen 320,000 Australians get into a home since in the last 3 years, Mr Speaker. And we saw in today's national accounts,
members on my left,
we saw dwelling investment up in today's national accounts, and dwelling investment is 11.4% higher through the year. And all that time that we're providing economic support to Australians, you know what else we're doing? Something those opposite would never do, providing tax cuts and tax relief, Mr Speaker. The biggest tax cuts that Australians have ever seen. Taxes cuts for families, tax cuts for small business and business investment incentives. So, Mr Speaker, while those opposite took $387 billion of higher taxes to the Australian people, we've been supporting them with lower taxes, supporting them with income and business support, and the net result is that unemployment today is lower than when we came to government.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Protecting the safety of Australians online, particularly for women and children, is a priority of this government, and it's critically important for communities across Australia, including families in my Central Coast community of Robertson. Will the Prime Minister inform the House? Will the Prime Minister inform the House of the strong and decisive action the Morrison government is taking to protect Australians from harmful online behaviour and unmask the trolls who are behind it?
Just before the Prime Minister gets the call, I call upon my members on my left. It's highly disorderly. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question. Mr Speaker, as a former telecommunications executive before she came to this place, Mr Speaker, the member for Robertson understands why it's so important for Australia to be a leading digital economy, and our digital economy strategy will be achieving that goal. A leading digital economy in the world, creating jobs and creating investment and economic opportunities for Australia into the future. And, Mr Speaker, that has been backed in by the fact that Google has invested $1 billion in Australia to ensure and back in the digital strategy that we have. And there are great advantages and great opportunities, but I know, as you in particular, though, Mr Speaker, that there are great threats and there are great dangers in the online world, Mr Speaker, which the member for Robinson knows about as a parent, Mr Speaker, and as a woman, Mr Speaker, has had to put up with abuse online, Mr Speaker. And she speaks with some authority on this matter, Mr Speaker. And that's why I was very pleased today, Mr Speaker, to invite the member for Robertson to lead a select committee, not looking only into the exposure draft legislation which we have released today, Mr Speaker, in relation to the online world and ensuring that digital companies, big tech companies, are held accountable for what they publish and we unmask the trolls, but more broadly to ensure that we are keeping up to speed, as we have been, as a world leader in regulating in the online space, so the rules in the physical world are the same as the rules in the digital world to keep Australians safe. Now, Mr Speaker, of the top 5 negative experiences in a recent survey, Mr Speaker, of Australian teenagers, they listed a negative online experience. 30%, Mr Speaker, of women disproportionately targeted for abuse online. Anti-trolling legislation, Mr Speaker, anti-trolling legislation which we are introducing and we will introduce in this parliament, and I'm happy to table the exposure draft, Mr Speaker, of that legislation. That legislation will add to the online Privacy Act, Mr Speaker, and the many other measures that our government has taken to ensure that we're seeking to keep Australians safe, and particularly women and particularly our kids. Now, we speak about many issues in this place. But I know as a parent, I know, Mr Speaker, as a member of parliament and as a Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, that this is an issue that is discussed in homes and clubs and communities all around the country. And we want those conversations that Australians and Australian families are having, and we want them to bring them here. And through the inquiry that will be led by the member for Robertson, Mr Speaker, we want to hear what they're doing to help their communities, help their kids, to be able to be protected and be safe online, Mr Speaker. This is an incredibly important issue for the future of our country. Social media is tearing at the very fabric of our society, Mr Speaker, and we need to protect our kids.
The Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My questions to the Treasurer. In the September quarter, the American economy grew, the United Kingdom grew, the Canadian economy grew, the German economy grew, the French economy grew, but the Australian economy contracted by 1.9%, the worst in the OECD so far. Isn't this because the government didn't order enough vaccines when it mattered and failed to establish purpose-built quarantine?
Members on my right. The Treasurer has the call.
No, and I can inform the member for Rankin that since this pandemic began, other than the US and the French economies, Australia's economic recovery from the pandemic has been stronger than other major advanced economies. Stronger than the Canadian economy, stronger than the UK economy, stronger than the Japanese economy, stronger than the German economy, stronger than the Italian economy. Now, Mr Speaker, it's an inconvenient and uncomfortable truth for the member for Rankin that even after the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression and the first pandemic in a century, unemployment under the coalition is lower than it was under Labor, Mr Speaker. And that's because our economic response to this pandemic has helped.
The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. None of this spin and marketing is relevant.
No, what's the point
is
of
relevant
order?
to the fact that Australia is last in the OECD.
Order.
28th out of 28 countries.
The member for Rankin will resume his seat. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Rankin for his question, but it's an inconvenient truth for him that the unemployment rate today is lower than when he was tagging the coat of Wayne Swan, Mr Speaker. It's lower than under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. It's an inconvenient truth for the member for Rankin there are more trade apprentices today than when Labor was in government, Mr Speaker. It's an inconvenient truth for the Labor Party that despite this COVID recession, we've seen business investment up by 9.1% off the back of business investment incentives. It's an inconvenient truth for the member for Rankin and for the Labor Party that when they took to the Australian people $387 billion of higher taxes, it was rejected by the Australian people, and instead they voted for lower taxes and for the coalition. And since that time, we have delivered lower taxes. And it's an inconvenient truth for the member for Rankin that in the September quarter, we saw more than $10 billion in tax relief provided to more than 11 million Australians, which were the largest tax cuts in a quarter for more than 20 years. Now, Mr Speaker, these are the facts. More people in a home, Mr Speaker. More people in a job, Mr Speaker. More people getting tax cuts, Mr Speaker.
Order.
And more people
Members on my
having a
left.
stronger recovery from the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression.
The member for Riverina has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government continues—
The member for Riverina will resume his seat. Members on my left, I cannot hear the question when there's such noise coming from the left side of the chamber. The member for Riverina will recommence his question from the start.
Do I have to? My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government continues, and that's the key word, to deliver critical infrastructure, creating jobs and driving growth across the nation? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches?
Order. Order. Members on my left. Member for Macarthur. Member for Sydney. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note the great work that the minister, when there was Minister for Transport, like previous National Party ministers, Tim Fischer, Warren Truss, has done in building nation-building infrastructure. The vital work that was done, especially within the Nationals, of things such as the duplication of the Pacific Highway, and also major projects such as the Western Sydney Airport. Mr Speaker, I note that the member for Riverina was instrumental in this nation-building infrastructure, which is so vital for a nation to have a path into the future, a purpose into the future, infrastructure for the future. Nation-building infrastructure makes the nation strong. And things such as the Inland Rail, 1,716 kilometres of it, from Melbourne up to Brisbane, and now the business case that we are starting on the process of building it from Toowoomba down to Gladstone. This shows a side of the House that has a vision for the future. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Riverina also asked about alternate policies, but of course it's incredibly difficult for the Labor Party to have alternate policies because their coalition colleagues, the Greens, don't believe in building very much at all. The coalition colleagues, the Greens, do not believe in building very much at all, and every time we go down the process of trying to construct dams, like we have at Scottsdale, and I know the member for Riverina is very much across the dams that he was instrumental in building down in Tasmania at Scottsdale, and the work we are doing, the construction of Rookwood, where all other water infrastructure projects such as McAllister Irrigation District or the Wimmera-Mallee Pipeline. One of the biggest problems we always have is the caveats placed on us by Green legislation pushed by the Greens. And the Labor Party has obviously joined to the hip with the Greens. And you can see this permeating right through, even into the left wing of the Road Party. I was amazed the other day to read a tweet by the member for Moreton, Graham Perrott. And he said, we have now driving infrastructure not only into the big projects, but into the small ones, into roads that have not had major upgrades in the last 50 years. But But Mr. Barrett said, my grandfather was a grader driver during the Great Depression. If a road hasn't had a grader on it since the 30s, why on earth would a responsible federal government make it a priority when the population in the bush is decreasing? And that is the attitude of the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. The attitude of the Labor Party is they take the regions as a joke. They sneer and jeer at the regions. They think it's a joke. They don't respect it. They don't respect Central Queensland. They don't respect regional areas. They have never come to the dispatch box with a vision for regional Australia, a major piece of infrastructure for regional Australia. They have never come to the dispatch box and said it because they don't have one.
The Leader of the Opposition. Member for Moreton. That is my final warning to the member for Moreton. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister take responsibility for the fact that his failure on vaccines and purpose-built quarantine caused the worst downturn in the OECD?
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister has.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. The policies that were put in place by the government as part of the cooperative arrangements we had with the states and territories ensured that back in March of 2020 we were able to quickly put in place a system of quarantine, Mr. Speaker, that enabled Australia to have one of the lowest fatality rates in the world in relation to COVID. And, Mr. Speaker, those quarantine arrangements were of course agreed with all the states and territories, strongly supported back in March, Mr. Speaker, but it wasn't just the state and territory leaders who supported those arrangements on quarantine, because, Mr. Speaker, on the 27th of March, the Leader of the Opposition tweeted this: Australian Labor supports new quarantine laws using hotels for overseas arrivals. Mr. Speaker, that's what the Leader of the Opposition says. That's what he says, Mr. Speaker. And as usual, what we have from the Leader of the Opposition is he says he supports hotel quarantine, Mr. Speaker, when we're announcing it, and then he comes into this place and says it's not appropriate, Mr. Speaker. And each way bet on every single position, Mr. Speaker. If you don't like what this Leader of the Opposition says one day—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. It goes to relevance. The question was about the worst downturn in the OECD and about the government's failures on vaccines and purpose-built quarantine. You, of course, had to use temporary stuff till you build purpose-built quarantine, which is what state governments wanted.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is entitled to compare and contrast to some extent, but I'd ask the Prime Minister to return to the question.
Speaker. And so that arrangement ensured that we're able to save more than 30,000 lives in this country. Today, Australia has one of the highest vaccine rates in the world, Mr. Speaker, and we indeed have one of the strongest economies coming through this pandemic. Now, those opposite, Mr. Speaker, want to talk down the economy. The September quarter of this year, Mr. Speaker, was a very difficult time for Australians. It was an incredibly difficult time for Australians, and I'm asked why, Mr. Speaker, because they may have escaped them. But there's a COVID-19 pandemic happening around the world, Mr. Speaker. Around the world, Mr. Speaker.
Members on my left
don't seem to be aware that when there is a pandemic, outbreaks occur,
Member for McNamara is warned.
Outbreaks occur, and as a result of those outbreaks, as the member will recall, as a result of a limousine driver not wearing a mask in Sydney, Mr. Speaker, that's what caused that outbreak, and from there it went to other states, Mr. Speaker. That's what we know, and we know, Mr. Speaker, that the national vaccine strategy had in place us reaching the high levels of vaccination rates by the middle of October this year, which was reached. So what we see from those opposite, Mr. Speaker, is they want to say they support measures on the pandemic, and then on the other hand they oppose measures on the pandemic, and they have each-way bet politics on a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. What I know about the Australian economy, Mr. Speaker, is that we have had one of the strongest economies coming through this pandemic of any advanced nation in the world. And what is happening now is 350,000 jobs came back into that economy in the last 5 weeks as we've opened up, as the economy springs back.
Expired. And I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister. The allegations of abuse, assault and bullying exposed yesterday in the Set the Standard report were revolting and a stain on this place. It took the courage of Brittany Higgins to speak up publicly about an alleged rape in one of your own minister's offices and the public outcry and condemnation for you and your government to take action, despite a number of people within ministerial offices knowing about the allegations for nearly 2 years. Will you implement in full and without delay, before the next election, all the recommendations of the report?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I share her view about the abhorrent nature of the practices that have taken place in this building. Now, the member is fairly new to this building, and I was simply saying, Mr Speaker, that she would also be aware, as a result of the Jenkins review, and I commend Commissioner Jenkins for the work that she has done, that she is talking about practices and behaviour that have been taking place in this building for a very long time. And that has been abhorrent, Mr Speaker. And I welcome the Jenkins review, and I was very pleased to stand with the Minister for Women yesterday, Mr Speaker, and very pleased to stand with the Minister for Finance and respond to that report and welcome it, Mr Speaker, and I look forward to working through the multi-party process to ensure we can follow through on the report that was provided. I share the view that the Labor Party has put forward in their statement, Mr Speaker, by Senator Farrell and the member for Sydney and the Shadow Minister for Finance, where they said Labor will carefully consider its findings and recommendations, and most importantly, we will consult with our staff on our response. And I think that's an appropriate response, Mr Speaker. It mirrors the response of the government, the Liberal Party and the National parties. I'm assuming that is a similar view of the Greens and other parties represented in this place. This is a problem this whole parliament has. This whole parliament has this problem, and everyone in this building has this problem. And I think Commissioner Jenkins has done an outstanding job in identifying many of the drivers that have led to this behaviour, not just recently, but over a long period of time. And those of us who have been in this building, and I have absolutely no doubt, Mr Speaker, the women who have served in this building, whether as members or senators or staffers, or those who have been in the media gallery or other parts of this building, because the Commissioner looked at all of the employees of this building and surveyed all of the employees of this building, and she has laid out, I think, a very good and broad-ranging report which addresses all of the issues that we will be able to need to take forward. And I look forward to working as we have done, as we've put in place the independent complaints process, we've put in place the counselling services, already acting on the Foster report, which I commissioned immediately at that time. This is not a matter for partisan politics, and it is not being pursued as a partisan political matter by the Leader of the Opposition. And I welcome that, and I look forward to working with him and all the other members of this place so we can take this report forward for the sake of all who work here now and all who will work here in the future.
The member for Groom has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Morrison government's clear record of strong and decisive economic management maintaining our economy's resilience through the COVID-19 pandemic for the benefit of Australian businesses and families, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Groom for his question, acknowledge his experience as an engineer, as a volunteer firefighter and as someone who is a strong advocate for inland rail, Mr Speaker, and the benefits that that provides. Now, Mr Speaker, Australia's had one of the strongest economic recoveries through this pandemic. We've seen a stronger recovery here than in Canada, than in the United Kingdom, than in Germany, than in Italy, than in Japan. Today we got the September quarter national accounts, and it did show a contraction of 1.9% in the September quarter, as our two largest states, New South Wales and Victoria, were in lockdown. But growth is up 3.9% through the year, Mr Speaker. And we saw in New South Wales it contracted by 6.5%, in the ACT 1.6%, and in Victoria 1.4%. None of this was a surprise, Mr Speaker, because 13 million of our fellow Australians were in lockdown. But the good news is that those Delta lockdowns are now behind us, and we've seen an easing of restrictions across New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT. And since the start of September, 350,000 jobs have come back, Mr Speaker. 350,000 jobs have come back. And we saw in the retail trade numbers for October a 4.9% increase. And we've heard from the retailers that they've started to see their customers come back. And with the Black Friday sales, they say that more than $5 billion was spent, a 50% increase on the previous year. So too with investment intentions. The latest ABS CapEx survey showed that investment intentions for non-mining investment were the strongest on record, with an expectation more than $100 billion would be spent this year, Mr Speaker, supported by incentives that we have been provided in consecutive budgets. Now, I'm asked about alternative approaches. Well, we know that this weak Labor leader will not stand up.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. I'd ask the Treasurer just to withdraw that comment. I thought I spoke about that matter yesterday. I spoke about that matter yesterday. The Treasurer will return to the dispatch box.
Well, Speaker, I was referring to the—
I've asked the Treasurer to withdraw that comment.
I'm referring to the alternative proposed by the Leader of the Opposition, which is to deliver higher taxes to the Australian people. Higher taxes to the Australian people. How do we know? Because his shadow Treasurer, front page of the Australian, Jim Chalmers, proposes Bill Shorten-era family trust tax hit, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party did at the last election. That's what they'll do at the next election. Only one side of this House can be trusted to deliver a stronger economy.
The member for Jaga has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Why does the Treasurer always talk about reducing taxes when in truth he is the second highest taxing Treasurer of the last 30 years?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, we have been cutting taxes for all Australians, Mr Speaker. That is our policy. That is our policy. And at the last election, only one side of this parliament went to the Australian people with a tax to GDP cap of 23.9%. And if the Labor Party had got their way and introduced their $387 billion of higher taxes, that tax to GDP ratio would have been close to 26%, Mr Speaker. The reality is we've been cutting taxes for families against the wishes of those opposite, so that somebody on $60,000, a teacher or a tradie or a nurse, is paying $6,480 less tax as a result of policies that we have passed through this parliament. Business investment incentives with the expanded and extended instant asset write-off that has seen non-mining investment intentions for this year. About over $100 billion of investment is being planned. The loss carry-back measures, Mr Speaker, the patent box that I announced at the last budget, the small business tax cuts that is seeing small businesses pay their lowest tax rate in 50 years at 25 cents in the dollar. We have been opposed every step of the way by those opposite when it comes to taxes. When it comes to taxes, only one side of this House can be trusted to deliver lower taxes, and it is the Liberal and National parties. It is the coalition. It is the coalition. It is the coalition that can be trusted to deliver lower taxes. And we remember the member for McMahon at the last election, who said, if you don't like our tax hikes, don't vote for us. And what did they do? They didn't vote for them. And remember the member for Rankin, who said he was proud and he was pleased of Labor's retirees tax and the Labor's housing tax. And the member for Maribyrnong, who talked, Mr Speaker, about retirees and small business being the top end of town and sitting at the back of their yachts. Remember the class warfare from those opposite, Mr Speaker, attacking small businesses, attacking family businesses, attacking retirees, attacking people with superannuation, attacking people who all they wanted to do was keep more of what they earned. There is one side of this House that has consistently delivered lower taxes. It is this coalition. It is the Liberal Party and the National Party, Mr Speaker. It is only the Labor Party who's proposing higher taxes. The Australian people rejected them at the last election, and at the next election they'll have an opportunity to do just the same.
Just before I call the member for Sturt, in one of those interjections, did the member for Rankin make an unparliamentary remark? You want to come to the dispatch box?
I withdraw.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's economic plan, which includes cutting taxes and supporting investment, has helped Australian families and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Sturt for his question and acknowledge his experience in the wool industry, Mr Speaker, and acknowledge also his strong advocacy for lower taxes for the people of Sturt. And I can inform the House that in the Sturt electorate, more than 80,000 people are getting a tax cut as a result of policies supported by those on this side of the House. And more than 30,000 businesses are eligible for the expanded instant asset write-off, Mr Speaker, policy that has been advocated and supported by this side of the House, and a policy that has seen business investment up by 9.1% through this pandemic. Now, Mr Speaker, last March, when thousands of our fellow Australians were lining up outside Centrelink, when fear was running across the community, when the economy was going into lockdown, and when Treasury expected that unemployment could reach as high as 15%, more than 2 million people unemployed, we responded with a range of measures, including JobKeeper and the cash flow boost, and support for veterans and carers and others on income support, allowing Australians to access their own superannuation, because after all, that is their money, and supporting industries like the airline industry to stay up and running despite those lockdowns, and to supporting small businesses like zoo operators, Mr Speaker, through the crisis, who again encountered challenges to their businesses as people were in lockdown. And we cut taxes. And we've consistently cut taxes for small businesses, we've consistently cut taxes for families, and we've consistently provided incentives to businesses to invest, with the expanded instant asset write-off and the loss carryback measure. And the good news is that the economy now is starting to recover, and recover strongly, because 350,000 jobs have come back since September. And we saw retail sales up by 4.9% in October. And we've seen non-mining investment expectations, approximately $100 billion plus of non-mining investment planned for this year. Now, Mr Speaker, we have consistently delivered lower taxes, while those opposite consistently propose higher taxes. And, Mr Speaker, again, it was the member for Rankin. It says Jim Chalmers proposes Bill Short-era family trust tax hit. It was on the front page of the Australian, Mr Speaker.
Treasurer will resume his seat for a moment. Treasurer will resume his seat. Point of order, Leader of the Opposition. Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, these are inconvenient truths. These are inconvenient truths. This Leader of the Opposition supports higher taxes. That's their track record. That's what they'll do after the next election.
I would just ask the Leader of the Opposition to, if he is going to come to the dispatch box to ask a question, to do it at the appropriate time rather than prematurely. The Leader of the Opposition has the
Thanks,
call.
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Australia is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a dedicated Centre for Disease Control. In my 2020 budget reply, I pledged that Labor would establish an Australian Centre for Disease Control. Why won't the Prime Minister?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I understand that the Leader of the Opposition is proposing the American response to the pandemic. We have taken the Australian response throughout the pandemic. Very sensitive.
The Minister for Health will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of order, Mr Speaker, is it in order for the minister at the beginning of his answer to ask himself a separate question?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. You may not like the answer that the Minister for Health is giving. No. The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Australian outcome is one of the strongest outcomes in terms of saving lives and protecting lives and vaccination rates in the world. I understand that the opposition has a different approach. We've seen that pretty much throughout the pandemic. There has been very little support for the measures which this government has taken that have saved lives on a scale that are seen around the world as one of the finest and strongest and most profound outcomes in terms of lives being saved. 30,000 lives being
Members
saved.
on my left.
They may wish to propose the US response or the European response, because that is what a CDC is.
The Minister for Health will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of order, Mr Speaker, on relevance.
What's the point of order?
On relevance, Mr Speaker. He's speaking about America. I'm talking about an Australian Centre for Disease Control.
Leader of the Opposition,
the hint is in
the Leader of the
Australian.
Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House, and just before the Leader of the House commences, when I'm being yelled at from both sides in both ears, it's very difficult to hear what's going on. The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, in accordance with the standing orders, the opposition has the ability to raise one relevance point of order. That was raised earlier, and Mr Speaker, I mean this is a continual habit of the Leader of the Opposition. He has a glass jaw, as we know, and pops up frequently, but it's not, Mr Speaker, it's not within his ability to do that.
This is one of the problems that arises out of points of order when order. One of the Leader of the Opposition, this is particularly directed at you, one of the issues when the Leader of the Opposition approaches the dispatch box and doesn't immediately state the point of order is that I don't need the advice. One of the issues when the Leader of the Opposition does approach the dispatch box and doesn't state the point of order there becomes a situation where there's an uncertainty as to whether you've previously raised, for instance, a point of order in relation to relevance. So I'm going to ask and reiterate to the Leader of the Opposition the importance of stating the point of order when he does come to the dispatch box. The Minister for Health is being relevant and can return to the question. Member for Lawler is warned.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If Australia,
Member for McEwen is warned.
If Australia had the rate of loss of life of the OECD, there would have been 30,000 lives lost. If Australia had the loss of life, sadly, of the United Kingdom or the United States, upon which the model of the opposition is based, the loss of life would have been 45,000. By contrast, we have gone down the Australian way, and it has saved lives and it has protected lives. And that Australian way has been based upon a very simple principle, that we have a national incident centre with a chief medical officer who has been co-opted for the duration of the pandemic to all of the discussions within the National Security Committee, which the Prime Minister has chaired, and upon which all of the large decisions, the big decisions, the biggest decisions, have been made based on medical advice directly to the Prime Minister and the National Security Committee. And that structure includes the Communicable Disease Network of Australia, the AHPPC, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group, all feeding in through the National Incident Centre and the Chief Medical Officer. And when the big decisions have had to have been made, ultimately it was the National Security Committee, and ultimately it was the Prime Minister who had to take those decisions, and that structure has protected Australia. The bigger the decision, the more clear the vision of the Prime Minister, the strength of the approach he's taken, and the closing of the borders to China is as large a decision as any Australian has taken in peacetime since the Second World War, and that structure and those decisions have saved lives. We stand by our model, not the American model.
The minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm also delighted to ask a question to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please provide an update to the House on how the Morrison government is responding to the latest COVID-19 variant, Omicron, in order to protect the lives and livelihoods of Australians?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for North Sydney. And he's also been a great advocate for action in relation to HIV, and together we launched the PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, with regards to another pandemic. And that has helped save lives and protect lives in Australia, along with many others on all sides who've been advocates for action. But for this pandemic, as I was saying, when we look around the world, we see over 630,000 cases of COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. Now, agonisingly, over 8,200 lives lost in just the last 24 hours. And against that background, that which has occurred in Australia remains something to which almost every nation in the world would aspire. One of the lowest rates of loss of life in the world, one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world, and one of the strongest economic recovery over the course of the pandemic in the world. And these things have come from the actions which the government has taken. In particular, let me say, when we look at the vaccination rate, we now have 39.3 million vaccinations, 92.5% of Australians 16 and over who've had a first vaccination, 87% of Australians 16 and over who have had a second vaccination. And very significantly, as of today, we have now reached an extraordinary 99% of all Australians over the age of 60. It had been over the age of 70, now it's over the age of 60. So those who are most vulnerable are most protected. That is a level to which the whole world would aspire, 99% of over 60s. And we've done it in our way, on our watch, in our time. We've done it through a voluntary basis, but we've done it through advocacy and support. These things have protected Australians. And so in terms of the Omicron variant, the actions that we took on the weekend, the Prime Minister authorised them with the decisions which were immediate, to stop the flights from Southern Africa, to ensure that there was quarantine in place, to work with the states to make sure that the 72-hour provision was in place, which was endorsed and strengthened for the next 2 weeks by National Cabinet only yesterday under the Prime Minister's role of chairing it. These are the actions that have protected Australia, are protecting Australia, will continue to protect Australia, and will save lives and protect lives.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night, Senator Fierravanti-Wells told the Senate, and I quote, "Those who resist the introduction of an effective federal integrity body raises people's curiosity. One has to ask the question, are they conflicted? Why are they resisting the implementation of such a body?" End quote. What conflicts are preventing the Prime Minister establishing an effective anti-corruption commission?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker. None, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I have here our bill. I will. I will. About
Members-
350 pages
members
here,
on
Mr.
my left.
Speaker, of a detailed, well-designed Commonwealth Integrity Commission, Mr. Speaker. There's $150 million which has been put aside in the budget, Mr. Speaker, through the budget process to ensure that that can be implemented. We have done the work to ensure that an effective Integrity Commission can be implemented in this country, and there's only one obstacle to that being passed in this parliament. The Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party don't support this model. They don't want this model, Mr. Speaker. They want to be able to turn these matters into some sort of kangaroo court, Mr. Speaker, where it can be used for politicking and game playing, Mr. Speaker. There's the Shadow Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, on 9 occasions has frivolously referred matters and wasted the time of the Australian Federal Police and has been dismissed. Dismissed, Mr. Speaker. So I do not take, Mr. Speaker, the proposal, which is only 2 pages long from those opposite and consists of a couple of bullet points, as any serious proposal or any serious intention. If you wish to support a serious proposal, here it is. I table it for the members of the House.
Member for Dunkley, the Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The Opposition would be pleased to grant leave for
The
the Minister.
point of order? The Leader of the Opposition, is it on a point of order?
I'm offering leave for the Prime Minister to introduce the legislation. We can debate it now.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The government's not seeking leave. The member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you,
Member for
Mr.
Higgins has the
Speaker.
call.
My question is to the
Members
Minister.
on my left.
My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's strong record on online safety has been further bolstered by our world-leading anti-trolling laws and today's initiation of a parliamentary inquiry to put big tech under the microscope?
The Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Higgins for her question. Of course, she is a distinguished medical practitioner and researcher, and she's got a very strong interest in people being safe offline as well as online. And of course, our Liberal National Government has a very strong track record in keeping Australians safe online. We established the E-Safety Commissioner in 2015. We gave it powers to deal with the cyberbullying of children. We added powers to deal with the unauthorised sharing of intimate images. We promised a new Online Safety Act at the 2019 election. We consulted extensively on that in 2020. This year we've legislated that act, and the new powers for the E-Safety Commission will take effect from January next year. Over the weekend, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General came together to announce powerful new anti-trolling laws. For too long, these social media platforms have allowed anonymous trolls to get away with spewing bile and hate online with no consequences. So we're changing the law so that the platforms will be liable in defamation for comments made on the platform unless they meet the requirements specified, a complaint scheme so that if somebody is concerned they've been defamed, they can efficiently raise that concern and have the option, the person who posted that, to voluntarily take it down, and of course the power for the federal courts to require platforms to disclose identity information to allow the complainant to commence defamation proceedings. But, Mr. Speaker, this is a fast-moving space, and we saw just a few months ago testimony by Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan, which has revealed troubling new information about the practice of the tech giants. Do, for example, the algorithms used by big tech drive users, including children, down a rabbit hole of viewing ever more problematic content? So, Mr. Speaker, what we've announced today is we're establishing a parliamentary select committee to give Australians the chance to raise their concerns about big tech. The member for Robertson, who of course is a former teacher, a former telco executive and a mum, as well as a very effective member of parliament. She will chair this inquiry and is going to consider a range of the online harms faced by Australians, whether algorithms increase those harms, the mental health impacts. These are issues, Mr Speaker, of great concern to Australian families, Australian parents, indeed to just about every Australian, and this is a chance for those who are concerned to be heard. It's also, of course, a chance for the big tech companies to come before this Parliamentary Select Committee and explain what they're doing to keep their users safe and to satisfy the Australian people through the parliament that what they're doing is sufficient. This, Mr Speaker, is precisely the kind of work the parliament should be doing. Keeping Australians safe is a very high priority for this government.
The member for Hotham has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. In the Senate last night, Senator Fierravanti-Wells said a National Anti-Corruption Commission is overdue and questioned why the government is resisting an effective commission. With the majority of the House and now a senior Liberal senator demanding the Prime Minister act, will the Prime Minister introduce an anti-corruption bill today so the parliament can get on with having the integrity debate the nation so clearly wants us to have?
The Prime Minister has a call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've tabled the legislation, the draft legislation, Mr Speaker, that is the product of the design work that is being done on a proper Commonwealth Integrity Commission. A proper Commonwealth Integrity Commission, Mr Speaker, is not supported by the Labor Party. It's not supported by the Labor Party, and that is what is preventing this matter from proceeding.
The member for Order. The member for Isaacs will come to the dispatch box and withdraw that unparliamentary remark.
I withdraw.
The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister advise the House how the Morrison government is supporting Australian manufacturers to grow and create jobs and ensure they have an affordable, reliable supply of energy? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and for her relentless focus on manufacturing in Western Sydney and right across this great nation, Mr Speaker. She's backing our manufacturers to grow their businesses and grow jobs. And of course, we're back now to 1 million people working in manufacturing across Australia. We haven't seen that since those opposite put in place their carbon tax a number of years ago, Mr Speaker. But we're back to over 1 million now. 7,500 of those are in Western Sydney. 7,500 in Western Sydney, and there's 800 manufacturers in Western Sydney. And we were, the member for Lindsay and I were lucky enough to visit one of those, ACCO, a proud Australian manufacturer in Western Sydney in her electorate just last week. They provide the products used in the major infrastructure projects going on right across this nation, Mr Speaker, including Nancy Bird Walton Airport, the Northern Road in her electorate, Mr Speaker. And they, like all manufacturers that are energy intensive, rely on gas to make their products locally. They rely on that affordable, reliable energy, and they need access to affordable, reliable gas, Mr Speaker. Now, Ken from ACCO confirmed to us that his energy costs have come down over 30%, Mr Speaker, over 30%, and he's able to reinvest the savings on that reduction in energy costs in their business, and we want to make sure this continues. Mr Speaker, that's what our plan is focused on, and that's why we recently put out a national gas infrastructure plan, making sure we've got the pipeline infrastructure in place, the supply sources in place to make the most of the energy resources this country has, Mr Speaker. And it includes projects like the Kurri Kurri generator in the Hunter Valley, 660 megawatts for when the Liddell generator closes, Mr Speaker. But I was asked about alternatives, and we've seen alternatives in the United Kingdom and Europe, where we've seen a 400% increase in the gas price, which hasn't occurred here, Mr Speaker. But the other question is what those opposite are planning. What's their alternative, Mr Speaker? We don't know their plan for gas. We don't know their plan for net zero. We don't know their targets for 2030 or their plan for net 2030. But we do know that the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Opposition has jokers to the left, clowns to the right, and he's having a bet each way, Mr Speaker. He's having a bet on both the clowns and the jokers. But I tell you what, we know if the member for McMahon has his way, he'll be tearing up the Kurri generator. He'll be getting rid of those jobs, Mr Speaker, and he'll be letting the price of electricity go up when the Liddell generator closes, Mr Speaker. He rejected the Kurri generator before he even saw the business case, Mr Speaker. If you want to have secure work in this country, you have to have secure energy.
The member for Gorton has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Herald Sun revealed this week that Border Force officials are failing to even look at the vaccine certificates of arrivals at our international airports. Baristas need to see a vaccine certificate when people buy a coffee in Sydney. So why don't Border Force officials demand the same thing from people entering Australia?
The Prime Minister.
Minister for Home Affairs, I'm sure may wish to add to this answer.
Members on my left.
I have tremendous respect and confidence in our Border Force, Mr Speaker. It was actually our government that established the Border Force, Mr Speaker, and it did an amazing job, particularly following on from the great work in stopping the boats and ensuring that Australia's borders were secure, and they continued to do that job every single day. And in these practices, Mr Speaker, the Border Force put in place arrangements with the international airlines to ensure that uplift was taken back where proof of vaccination is provided at the point of uplift, and that the Border Force was then undertaking compliance activities with arrivals. Mr Speaker, that was further upgraded last weekend to ensure that not only is that done at the point of embarkation, but on arrival, Mr Speaker, with all of those arrivals coming through. So it is just simply false, Mr Speaker, for those officers to come and cast a slur on the fine work done by our Border Force, Mr Speaker, in the middle of a pandemic, Mr Speaker. They bring this in here, so as usual, Mr Speaker, as usual, we have the Labor Party saying, oh yes, we support the work on the border, but we're happy to get stuck in, Mr Speaker, and given the slap at the same time, Mr Speaker. The Minister may wish to answer.
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to add to the response just given by the Prime Minister. What we have implemented is a multi-layered approach to making sure that we have in place the appropriate checks and balances to ensure that when people enter this country, they do have the appropriate vaccination status and certification. So prior to uplift, an individual passenger or families have to make sure that they have a negative PCR test available. That is checked by the airline on check-in. It is also checked that they have the appropriate vaccination status for every individual or every member of the family that's transiting or coming through to Australia. So that is the first part of the process. Now, of course, when they do arrive in Australia, we do make sure that there are the appropriate checks and balances to make sure that there is in place checks to ensure that these people have the appropriate vaccination status. That includes checks by the Australian Border Force. Now, I do have to say, Mr Speaker, that the Australian Border Force has been exemplary in the work that it has done, firstly to ensure that our borders are open, that we are in a position to be able to welcome back people to Australia as soon as we possibly can do so and as soon as it is safe for us to do so. So Border Force has worked very consistently for a number of months to make sure that everything that is needed is in place to ensure that people who arrive into Australia have been able to demonstrate the negative PCR test and that they have the appropriate vaccination status.
The member for Wentworth has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Science and Technology. Will the minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's investment in quantum technologies is securing our technology future and creating jobs as we come back from COVID-19?
The Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Science and Technology has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Wentworth, and he knows how important science is to our nation and also the importance of Australia's commercialisation of research and development. Mr Speaker, advances in technology are reshaping everyday Australian lives. And I know many in this House will remember the days where we were operating a computer that was the size of a small bedroom, or later perhaps the size of a suitcase, or a mobile phone the size of a house brick. Today we can hold these small devices in the palm of our hands. Mr Speaker, we have come remarkably far in technology advances, and Australia has played a key role on the global stage, inventing Wi-Fi and the black box, not forgetting the Victor mower, spray-on skin and the first ultrasound scanner. Many inventions that have helped to shape the world that we know it now. And now, Mr Speaker, we are on the verge of a new frontier, and I speak of quantum technology. Mr Speaker, and I don't blame anyone in this House that would have trouble explaining it, but I have no doubt that people will understand the significance of quantum technology. Quantum will unlock smarter, more accurate and faster computers that can solve the most complex problems we encounter today that current computers cannot do. For defence, it can enhance our intelligence capability, cracking those codes. Mr Speaker, it will also transform the way that doctors diagnose and treat cancers. And, Mr Speaker, it will help our miners unlock resource deposits. In fact, Mr Speaker, it was only just this morning that I met with our Chief Scientist, Dr Cathy Foley. Now, she is very famous, our Chief Scientist, because her and her team, they were able to develop an application called Land Tem Sensor System. Now, this system is used to unlock valuable deposits of minerals deep underground, and this has led to mineral discoveries worth more than $6 billion. That's why she's our Chief Scientist, Mr Speaker. And this is why our government has announced our blueprint for critical technologies and the National Quantum Strategy. Our government will invest over $110 million to secure our quantum future. We estimate that our investments in this new and exciting field of technology advancement will create some 16,000 jobs by 2040 and contribute some $4 billion to our national economy. And our investment provides a much-needed confidence boost for our industry, which is why Google will invest $1 billion in Australia to unlock the growing potential of this technology. They're going to work closely with CSIRO to help to develop a research hub and to be at the forefront of quantum technology research. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is embracing this critically important technology. We're going to drive jobs, we're going to grow the economy, we're going to ensure that Australia is at the forefront of this amazing technology.
Order. The member for Maribyrnong has the call.
My question's to the Prime Minister. Harper is 5 years old. He's been diagnosed with Batten's disease. Batten's disease is a degenerative neurological condition that gives children living with it an average life expectancy from diagnosis of 7 to 10 years. Now, Harper had been funded for 24/7 home care under the NDIS, but in May, Harper's funding was cut by more than half to only allow for 3 overnight care visits a week. Why is this, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme to respond further. The issue that has been raised by the member sounds very concerning, and, Mr Speaker, Harper's condition sounds absolutely heartbreaking, but for him, but also for his family. And I will ask the Minister to make further comment on this, but I'd be pleased to learn more of that case and look into that matter with the Minister.
The Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme has
thanks, Mr Speaker. We thank the member for Maribyrnong for bringing the matter to the House's attention. The NDIS as an insurance scheme is designed to provide funding that is reasonable and necessary. And in this case, on the facts the member has presented, it sounds both reasonable and very necessary. It's designed to go up and down with stages of someone's life. I'll speak to the Minister directly after we're finished here to ensure that the funding is necessary for the various stages of this little child's life, and if need be, we'll get the situation reviewed as is provided for under the law.
The member for Mallee has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison-Joyce government has continued to support the agricultural industry to achieve record production levels, and how this government has ensured new export markets are explored and trade barriers are minimised?
The Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for her question, because she, better than anyone, understands the importance not just agriculture but agricultural trade to regional and rural Australia, and particularly to those 334,000 Australians that work in agriculture. 3 in 4, every one of those jobs relates to trade, and it's proud to say that we are continuing to invest in that. And the account figures today prove the importance of not just increasing our production, which has gone for the first time in our nation's history to over $70 billion, but the agricultural GDP has gone up by 44% from the September quarter this year to the September quarter last. That's an amazing result in the face of bushfires, droughts and floods. We've also increased our exports by 47%. So while we're increasing in production, we have to find a market for it. And part of the Ag 2030 plan is investing significantly in our export markets. $330 million put aside to increase market access. And that's not just the free trade agreements, that's actually about the market access. And that's putting boots on the ground. 22 agricultural councillors and 5 surge councillors looking at market access commodity by commodity, breaking down the technical barriers. In fact, they've improved over 53 market access agreements, maintained 111 and improved another 55 market access agreements. And some of that has been seen as the first boatload of barley going to Mexico to go into their beer. Over 700,000 tonnes going into Saudi Arabia, getting better market access for India and Pakistan and Nepal, and also getting longer shelf life agreements for our meat into Saudi Arabia. We're also putting more scientists within the Agriculture Department to ensure that we get through the risk assessments quicker to be able to meet their requirements to get that market access. It's very important. And for the first time, we have a national agricultural representative to go to international fora to be able to articulate that agricultural production systems here are different to those around the world, and therefore we should have different methods of being able to produce the best food and fibre in the world. We're also trying to streamline and modernise our trade export platforms. We've gone 330,000 export certificates are printed out every year. We are now digitising them. We are making sure that it is done once, and those that want to apply to get an export permit, instead of doing 20 paper-based applications, they will do one online one, and we will get out of their life and allow them to get on with the job that they do. We're modernising also through industries, working with the red meat sector, putting in place 40-year reforms around the modernisation using technology so that they can use Google glasses to do inspections by our department, cutting the costs of the red meat industry by $45 million a year. That means more jobs in regional Australia. Our Ag 2030 plan is about growing agriculture and growing the future for regional and rural Australia.
The member for Maribyrnong has the call.
And my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Parent, single mum, Sarah, who lives in Perth, has said publicly that a shock $70,000 cut to her 11-year-old autistic son's Jonah's NDIS plan means she'll only be able to afford a support worker once or twice a week. She's probably going to have to quit her job to care for him. Why did the Morrison government cut Jonah's plan?
The Minister representing the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme has the call.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. Let me thank the member for Maribyrnong for his question. In the particular case the member's raised, I'll speak to the member afterwards to get the details in full, quite confidentially, of the participant in question, and we'll chase it up and have a look. As you know, the law actually has a requirement for plans to be reviewed and updated as required. It is important, though, for the House to understand the Morrison government over the last 12 months has put in over $17 billion extra into the NDIS. It could be the largest estimate variation of any program of any government in our nation's history. That gives an indication to the House of the commitment of the entire House to this scheme.
Minister will resume his seat. The member for Maribyrnong on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, this was about Jonah Sullivan's cut of over $70,000, not about the NDIS in general.
His seat. Member for Maribyrnong, resume your seat. When a question is asked without notice about a specific incident or a specific example, such as this, no one could expect a minister to know the facts and circumstances behind that particular case. The minister is being relevant and will return to... Member for Newcastle is warned. Member for the minister has the call.
Speaker, the beauty of the NDIS is the scheme started in a bipartisan way and it's continued that way to everyone's credit. And I think the parliament as a whole should be proud of what we've achieved together with the NDIS. It is an extraordinary world first in a scheme that no other country in the world has tried to put together in the time frame and in the way that collectively we've done it, with over 470,000 participants with permanent and significant disability, a social insurance scheme that every Australian can rely on, a scheme that enjoys the support of everyone in the House, a scheme whereby if Australians find themselves in difficulty, they know there is a social insurance policy there to assist them. Now, the issues of this particular case will certainly be looked into by the minister and the department, because with over 470,000 Australians being cared for in the insurance scheme, there are always opportunities to improve and to look at particular matters. But this is something we should be proud of. It is something the Morrison government is leaning into, and we're leaning into it heavily. There is no other program that has seen the sheer amount of resources that has gone into it to assist so many Australians, and that's something we should applaud. The Morrison government has always stood behind the NDIS. The Morrison government has built the NDIS. The Morrison government finalised all the agreements with the states and continues to work cooperatively and collaboratively towards this world first, and something that we all should collectively be proud of.
The member for Barker has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Businesses. Can the minister update the House on the strength of the Australian jobs market under the Morrison government's prudent economic management? Why is it so important, Minister, that every single Australian that can work gets into a job?
The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Barker for all the work he's doing in his electorate, and especially in some of the innovative ideas he's bringing forward to assist businesses, not just to get workers into a job but also workers into a home, and the work he's doing to champion that. We can all see the Morrison economic plan is working, with the Australian jobs market roaring back, that the Treasurer has spoken to today. And there has never been a better time for businesses to be hiring Australians right now. The National Skills Commission, through the Internet Vacancy Index, tells us that last month we saw a 13-year high of 250,000 jobs available right now, a 7.8% increase in October. Now, we know not all jobs are advertised online, so we know there's at least 280,000 jobs available right now for Australians to lean into prior to Christmas. Just spoken to the CEO of Amazon, an impressive national CEO. She's got coming up and now 1,500 jobs in Western Sydney right now. Right now we know there are over 29,000 Australians on the Job Active Network scheme right now in Western Sydney that are able to lean in to those jobs. There's 902,000 Australians on job seeker payment, Mr Speaker, and over 86,000 young Australians on youth allowance other, not in work and not in employment. And we know the best type of job seeker or youth allowance other, the best type of welfare, is a job. And we know the best way we're going to grow our economy is to move people into work. We also understand, we all appreciate the mutual obligations that Australians have got to put people into work. And I can report to the House the employer reporting line that the Morrison government put in place for those that aren't taking their mutual obligations seriously has received over 2,200 referrals, and 180 individuals are facing compliance action. But it's clear the jobs are there now. They're there now, They're there now for every Australian to take advantage of, and we would encourage every Australian to have a crack at those 280,000 jobs. July last year, the member for Rankin said the biggest test of the government's management of the recession and its aftermath will be what happens to jobs. And it's pleasing to say that we're seeing unemployment roaring back. The member for Rankin made it clear it's about whether or not unemployment stays too high, too long, whether unemployment stays too high, too long, and unemployment now is lower. Right now, coming out of a 100-year pandemic, unemployment is lower than when the Morrison government came into government. The economy is larger, growth is faster, the jobs are coming back. The Morrison economic plan is absolutely working.
That's your final warning. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.